here at the Vote Common Good podcast and live stream. And we're joined today by the good doctor out of Colorado Springs, Stephanie Spaulding, and Dominique Gilliard and Laura Truax. Hi, y'all. Thanks for being part of our co-hosts.
Hello.
Now, some
here.
of the frequent fans of the Vote Common Good podcast and live stream that has been going now for 2 days get to meet different hosts every day. Give us a little glimpse of each of you. Tell us who you are, where you're at, what you're up to, all that kind of thing. Stephanie, would you mind going first on all that?
I don't mind. Hello, everyone. I am Reverend Dr. Stephanie Rose Spaulding out of Colorado, and I profess at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. I also pastor Ebenezer Baptist Church, and I am the founder of the Truth and Conciliation Commission, which means I get no sleep, and I am happy to be here.
So glad to have you. Hey, Dominique, would you mind going next?
Yeah, I like Stephanie, lack sleep in my life. For my 9 to 5, quote unquote, I work for the Evangelical Covenant Church as the Director of Racial Righteousness and Reconciliation, which means I'm a pastor to pastors, helping them make connections between race and discipleship. In addition to that, I'm author of Rethinking Incarceration, and I have a forthcoming book called Subversive Witness, and I do a lot of ministry in regards to prison reform and get a chance to teach inside of a maximum security prison here in the suburbs of Chicago, though I live in the city limits.
Right on. So exciting. Hey, Laura.
Hey. Laura Truax here from Chicago, Illinois. I pastor LaSalle Street Church and been there for 2 decades now, which is quite a while. Have a few books out, Undone, a series of reflections on faith and life, and then a book called Love, Let Go, which talks about what does it look like when we practice the stance of generosity in the world. So very excited to be joining you guys and looking forward to this podcast. Thanks.
And this little get-together on Wednesdays of the four of us, we're all going to be hosting. And like we like to say on each of these, look, this podcast is a place we want you all to engage. So if you haven't already gone to votecommongood.com and subscribed to one of the many podcast links, we'd invite you to do that. In fact, it would really be great if you did, because the more listeners we get, the more magic that happens in the world of the internet. So we would very much appreciate your engagement over there. And as you know, this podcast is not just something that happens on Wednesdays when we talk about faith, which we will today with this fine host of or collection of faith leading hosts. But on Mondays, we talk about common good news. So it's sort of a news roundup, things that happen in our world. On all of these, we're always asking the question, what's happening in the world? And what can we do in light of it? So that's what we want to do. And when it comes to the news, on Tuesdays, Rob Ryerson and I host a conversation around politics. So is there a common good politic that we can all find? That's what we do on Wednesdays. On Thursdays, we're tackling issues. This week, we're going to be talking about climate and how it is that people of faith ended up opposing climate change initiatives so often. There's a new documentary that's out, so we're going to engage in that tomorrow. And then on Friday, we get into science. And astrophysicist Paul Wallace is the co-host of our Science Edition on Fridays. So all kinds of good things are happening there. Now, also want to tell you that, yes, you can find us on all the streams. Really, I think we're on all of them. So if you head over to Facebook at Vote Common Good, you can watch this simulcasting right there. So if you want not just an audio podcast, but you want to see what's going on, you can do that on Facebook. If you're on Twitter, we're Vote Common on Twitter. We're Vote Common Good just about everywhere else except Twitter, because they I'll let you have so many letters in all your things on Twitter. And then over on YouTube, you can track all the stuff on YouTube. And look, we would love for you to subscribe if you were to go over to YouTube. Please hit that subscribe button at YouTube/Vote Common Good. And our subscribers are really important to us over there. So please find us over there. And if you're a gamer and you know Twitch already, hey, esteemed hosting cast, I don't know if you all know Twitch, but Twitch is a thing. And I'm new to it, but it is happening. So if you're on Twitch, there's like a billion other people over there on Twitch as well. And of course, we're also find ourselves over on Instagram and all those places. So we want you to know that we've got a lot going on in the world of the Vote Common Good daily podcast and live stream. And most excited about this Wednesday day. In fact, as a pastor myself, as someone who's been thinking about the role of faith in my own life and the role of faith in our civic engagement and our civic participation, as someone who wants to be a public theologian as well as sort of a personal follower of the path of Jesus in the world, this conversation on Wednesday, it's like your children. You're not supposed to have favorites, but I think this one might be mine. So I'm super excited about it, and we're gonna go down some really great paths. And one of those, which is somewhat framed by the fact that, this is February and we recognize in this country that we take a moment to look at what's called Black history in this month of February. And I like to be reminded by all of my friends that, Black history is American history. So it's American history, right? But there's a special focus that we take to pay attention to it. And I really like that we do that as a nation and we do that as a country, because the issue of race, it seems to me, is the context we find ourselves in all the time. And that's going to be something we're going to talk about on this podcast. And in fact, our opening salvo into our podcast here, we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to talk about faith in light of the context of race that we find ourselves in. And Laura's been good enough to put some thoughts together to get us going. So thanks, Laura.
Yeah, sure. Wow. It is something that we're starting with a bang, I think, right? When you think about this intersection of race and God, I think it's a good bang. One of the things that's inherent in this podcast is that we're thinking that theology has practical implications, right? For our common life together, for our common good. And when we think about this twisted connection that Christianity has with white supremacy and white nationalism, and even earlier than that, right, the role of Christianity in the construction of race itself, we have a lot we need to be talking about when we start talking about race. You may hear in my voice, I'm from the South. I'm a fifth generation Southerner from Central Florida. And frankly, it was only until about 12 years ago, I would have thought I was one of the good guys on race. I honestly would. If you would have asked me something about race, I would have said, I'm not a racist. I don't see color. And it was about 12 years ago, really, when one of my kids, who was in high school at that point, introduced me to Harvard's implicit bias project. Do you know that one? That cognitive test that uncovers. Yeah, it's really powerful, isn't it? It's uncovering those split-second delays and those unconscious frameworks we use. Well, I realized I use them. And that implicit bias project started my journey, and by extension, really, the journey of our church, LaSalle Street Church, along this waking up to race is all I can describe it. We made a big hire. We hired an executive pastor. That was the first time our church had something like that. And we hired a Black man. That started to change our conversations. We started to make deliberate choices in the construction of our leadership team. Currently, we have more people of color than we do white people on staff. But it felt like at every turn, the more we saw, the more there was to see. The more we learned, the more we realized we don't know. And the more that we saw our own structures, from how we ran church meetings to the dynamics of our friendships or our trusted voices or our reading lists, the more we realized in our church body and in personally how much casual whiteness had just been the norm. Yeah, so that's when I started to get serious about race and racism. And I can only describe this phase we're in right now as like a second conversion. I know that's a big word, right? But it feels like metanoia in that classic sense, right? The metanoia, to change our minds. That's what it feels like is going on. In the last few years, one of my favorite authors wrote this: we cannot change what we cannot see, and we cannot dismantle what we don't understand. So I'm hoping we start to unpack that, because that's what I'm learning. I feel like these last few years have shown us these horrific costs of racism, paid in human lives, paid in lost talents, paid in a fractured society that goes straight through the middle. Maybe there is an awakening going on. I hope so, right? But I also know that lasting change, if it's going to really take root out there, it also has to take root in me and the structures that I've had a hand in building. So that's where I hoped we could begin today, by looking at this intersection of our own lives and this big thing of race. Thanks.
Well, that is a beautiful opening, and look, the issue of race is significant, powerful, dominating, really, in our society. Like, there's no way to talk about Christianity in America without talking about America, and there's no way to talk about America without talking about race, right? But it seems to me most of us, or a lot of us at least, feel like we're really bad at it, or at least we're not as good at it as we want to be, or we get nervous about it, or there's a lot of pieces to it. And I know other people that feel like, oh man, why are we talking about race all the time, right? I hear both of these things from inside myself, but also I hear them from other people. Like, how much is too much to talk about race? And I don't really know how, and I don't know what to do about it. So I don't know if that's the context the rest of you feel, but that's certainly something that I feel and have experienced with a lot of leaders.
I'm actually curious, Doug, to know, and I have to be like me to ask this question. Do you hear that from white people? Because, and that's important to say, whether or not you hear that from white people. Why are we always talking about race? Because for me, as an African American woman, I'm never not talking about race. The people that I am around are never not talking about race. And even to Laura's point of coming to a place of awakening where race is dominant and real for her 12 years ago with the implicit bias test, I'm trying to find a moment in my life where I was like, oh, yeah, I might want to like think about this. But again, even as a kid growing up on the south side of Chicago, it was still a very salient reality for me. Like, I knew that the fact that my neighborhood was predominantly Black, I knew that my best friend was Hispanic and African American, and that placed her like at 4 or 5, that placed her in a different space for me. Like, colorism was real at 4 for me. So I am really curious if that is part of your reality, that it is white people who say this, or any and everyone that you are in contact with.
That's a great question. I mean, to be truthful, I do talk to more white people and consume more typical media that comes from white, kind of white, as Laura put it, intentional and casual white sources. So yeah, I think that's clearly the case. And I think what's intriguing about your frame of it is, I was raised at a time when people would say stuff like, the way to be appropriate about race is to not focus on it, right?
Yes.
This is, and I don't know if that's just an age thing or a generational thing, but sort of in the 70s, like, you noticed it, but you didn't explicitly say it. Like, you didn't, so when I say talking about race, I didn't mean people didn't notice it, because people noticed it, but you didn't talk about it, right? Like, it was one of the things that if you brought it up, you were, like, you're pulling the race card, right? This is this thing I would hear all the time about this, which I didn't even know what that meant, but it just happened over and over and over. I remember sort of in the political sphere, there was that whole thing with Clarence Thomas, and and that's when I first started hearing people say, "Oh, now they're going to pull out the race card."
Right.
I'm like, race is a card? So yeah, I think you're raising something that I think points to the different experiences that we all have in this country, is our own lived cultural conditions kind of put us in a place where we're talking about things differently. And I've realized I've read the Bible, of course, through the context of my culture, and my culture was intentionally and casually race influenced and race muted in talking about it. And so that same thing showed up in how I thought about my own faith.
But I also know that we're here to really nuance the conversation about race. And so I don't want to speak in broad generalities in the way that, in my experience, Stephanie, another group that I hear ask that question are BIPOC folk who were raised in white spaces. and they've had to really suppress some of the trauma of race to get along and to kind of find stability in that context where race has been muted. And so that's another group that I think poses that question. But I think like you, you know, race has never not been a factor in my life and something that I was very cognizant of. In fact, my parents set me down at the age of 5 and had a conversation with me about what it means to be a Black man in the US. Now, clearly at the age of 5, I didn't comprehend everything that they were sharing with me, but it was essential to me that they did share it to me when they did, because I had my first major racial incident at the age of 6. And had they not talked to me about it at the age of 5, I would not have been able to start to make sense of what had happened to me at the age of 6 at an all-white private Christian school where the only other person of color was my older brother. And so I think this is critically important. And one of the things I have the privileges of doing with my job now is that I get a chance to lead a racial justice pilgrimage called Sankofa, where we really replicate the ethos of the 1960 Freedom Rides, and we partner people across racial lines, and we sojourn from Chicago down through the Southeast to historically significant monuments for civil rights where blood has been shed for freedom. So we go to the 16th Street Baptist Church. We go to the Equal Justice Initiative to see their Memorial for Justice and Peace. We go to the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was assassinated. And the whole time we're traveling, you're conversing with your partner around racial formation, the messages they were taught about race or not taught about race. Many times there are people who are alive during these incidents and how these incidents were discussed or not discussed in their household, in their congregation, all of these different things. And one of the critical questions we asked towards the beginning of the pilgrimage is, when was the first time, if ever, you remember having an explicit conversation with your parents about race? And disproportionately, African American participants say by the age of 10 or before. Yeah. And other participants, regardless of their racial ethnic identity, generally or later, and white participants are generally the latest if they ever had them. And a number of them will say, honestly, I've never had an explicit conversation with my parents about race. So that's kind of some of what we're trying to unpack. Like, what does that mean? Because it is profoundly informative for our understanding of race, our engagement with race, and even our understanding of how race has implications for our Christian discipleship.
That just really resonates with me, Dominique. And I have no memory of having that kind of explicit conversation ever with my parents. It just wasn't even part of the equation, which means there's a whole swath of people who are impoverished in terms of the tools, the handles, the language, and that feels very disorienting. And it also feels both insecure. I mean, I feel very insecure when I enter this space and I start talking about race. I question and then question again. And that has its own chilling effect, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely makes you kind of, like you said, insecure, but also I like to talk to people about it in the way of, like, so for me, I'm not somebody who likes to work out. But I can't just get up off the couch and go run a marathon. Like, I have to actually build muscle memory. And in the building of muscle memory, it's painful. It's something that I don't want to do, but I know it's good for me, so I keep with it. And so I think with these conversations, I think a lot of folks, kind of coming from the perspective you're talking about, they enter in, but when they feel that resistance, they say, well, maybe this isn't something I'm supposed to be doing. It doesn't feel good. I'm not getting a good reception from the body of Christ. I'm not getting a good reception from my intimate community. Why would I persist in this? And so it's one of those ways where I think really biblically, when we strip flip to the text where it talks about, the ways of the cross is foolishness to the ways of the world, like really to enter into these conversations when they're going to ruffle feathers, when they're going to cause you to actually disrupt community, when it's going to cause you funding in your congregation or your nonprofit. It doesn't make sense if you don't have to, quote unquote. And that's the reality of what we're trying to deconstruct. We live in a nation that basically says certain people have to be engaged in these conversations for their livelihood, for their children's safety and stability, and other people don't have to. And it's a lie. And it's something that the gospel explicitly tells us that that's not a truism, but it's something that, we've been socialized to believe as true.
And I don't even think it's accidental. Like I remember being taught, I wasn't raised in a Christian church, but when I was 16, I got into churches. And one of the early passages that I was taught in the sort of center set evangelical world that I was involved in was, that in Christ, there's no slave, there's no Jew or Gentile, no slave nor free, no male nor female, which I actually think is Paul saying that he's really, beyond category. He was ahead of us in a lot of this stuff, right? But the way it was used and what I was taught was, you see, around here, we don't talk about those things because that doesn't exist. So the teaching of that passage, which I think is trying to say you're called to, we can talk about what it probably really means, but how it was pitched was, there is no Jew or Gentile. The modern version of that is race and culture. So what we're called to be a person of faith, or to be a woke person in our society and world, is to be someone who then says, I'm beyond that. I've transcended that. I'm somebody who's now moved to a different space. And I will talk about the higher things and the more important things, right? And so all of this stuff was like partially, just the no talk rules of don't bring it up, but then also some intentional moves to try to say, the best way is to not talk about it, or to not even not talk about it, but to transcend it.
Yeah. And now I feel like pardon me, Stephanie, go ahead, please.
No. And I was just going to say, and knowing that the reality is there is no transcendence, right? Because there's absolutely no people of color in a lot of, again, 70s and even still now, a lot of these congregations, there's nobody there to challenge. There's no other voice even in the space to say, well, this is my experience. This is why even today, I get the phone calls. It's interesting that you attended a Catholic school, Dominic, because I just got a message from someone who was like, oh my God, I feel compelled to start a scholarship because I went to a Catholic school in New York City. And the reality is there were no Black people in our school because they couldn't afford to go to Catholic school, private school, or anything else. And that, I want to be able to bring more people in. So the transcendence or the not talk about it is to really like avoid it at all costs, right? Like we don't even want to experience it. We want to live in the most segregated hour in American culture and American society on Sunday mornings by making sure that we are not in space together, that we are not in conversation together. For me, and there are certainly some silences or what have you. And as much as race was always present, it doesn't mean that there were always deliberate conversations of calling race and racism out. Again, growing up on the South Side, my church was my everyday community. And when I say that, the vast majority of us lived within a 5-mile radius of each other, right? Like we could walk to somebody else's house. My playtime with my brothers and sisters was between our parents' house and the next person that attended the church with us. Like that's how far we could ride our bike, was the next person that went to church with us. But for us, and what I remember as a little girl, the issue of race came in very subtle ways of making sure I got my hair pressed every Sunday or before every Sunday, and the ways in which we were talked about in being bodily kept, right? Like whiteness was always present in our space, but it wasn't a deliberate, like, okay, this is because of race and racism. The way our parents were trained and acculturated to even present us was a reflection of dominant notions of whiteness, right? Like, if you cared about your children and their clothes had to be ironed, their knees had to be shiny, and their hair had to be straight, and pressed. And this was such an embedded part of our sense of being that by the time I got to college and I was like, I'm cutting all this mess off, everybody was like, oh my God, you're a radical Black person. And I was like, I just, like, I don't want to spend $80 in Atlanta trying to straighten my hair as a college student, So the ways that whiteness was so still central, even as a community of African Americans that were trying to speak back to whiteness, it was a dance. Like we learned Dr. Margaret Burroughs, what do I tell my children who are Black, when we were like in second grade, but we were still also practicing whiteness. And so again, like this conflict of being was so present, and it was shaped by the church for us.
Yeah.
And, I just want to chime in on that and say, yeah, though there was 100% these kind of subtle ways in which we were trying to navigate whiteness and trying to find dignity in our personhood and really affirm the belief even before the hashtag that Black Lives Mattered. There was this constant way in which this was this dance we were doing, but there were also these very institutional, strategic, intentional ways in which whiteness was forced upon us through our education, particularly in our history courses, in literature courses, what books are canonized as classic books that all people should learn from, all of these ways in which to be a BIPOC person in this nation is to have the additional challenge of trying to find ways to affirm your personhood in the midst of a society that really is rooted in and consistently and intentionally reperpetuating white supremacist ideology. How do you find yourself rooted in the truth of who God says you are and the inherent dignity that you have as an image bearer in the midst of a society that continues to tell you that you're supposed to be measuring yourself up against this standard that is not reflective of who you are, how God intentionally created you to be, and you don't get a chance to interface with people in positions of leadership who reflect the brilliance that emerges from your community. So many people really struggled with, and we saw this beautifully with, Kamala's appointment as VP. And you saw how much it meant to women across the board, but particularly to women of color who are able to see themselves in this level of position for the first time. There's this beautiful image, I don't know if people saw it, where Kamala was being sworn in, and there's like this little 2-year-old girl, and she goes up to the screen and she's giving her a high five. And it was just the encapsulation of everything that we're trying to express in this moment, where there is something that just is so deep in BIPOC folk who are trying to really find and affirm their dignity in the face of white supremacy in the church, in the schools, in media, everywhere we look. And, I think for some people, I was blessed to have parents who was very intentional, who taught me from a young age. My father used to work for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization that Dr. King founded. So I grew up with civil rights legends eating dinner at our dinner table. And so I didn't have the same kind of uphill battle that many people do, but folks who didn't have parents who were, embedded in the struggle, who were immersed in the knowledge of the brilliance of their community and were able to point people through. We talked about cognitive dissonance earlier, Laura, in regards to how do you enter into this conversation when you've never had it early on? How do you find your rooting in the midst of a disenfranchised community where, all you're told is like Jesus, nothing good can come from your community, and you're trying to find a way to affirm your personhood. And so, yeah, this is really complex stuff we're talking about.
Hey,
And for
Dominique,
anybody
would you
listening,
mind?
BIPOC.
Yeah, I was
I
just going
just
to
want to
say, somebody
explain.
define that. Yeah, thank you. I was thinking the same thing. That's beautiful.
I'm sorry.
No,
Yes,
it's good.
for anyone listening, BIPOC is abbreviation for Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Yeah.
And look, I think it's really helpful to do this, right? One of the ways that you grow and you change and you develop a new skill, that was a great metaphor that you were using, Dominique, about working out or something, like how you develop new muscles is, well, you have to develop some new language, right? And that's a learning process. And I have found, so many of us don't like to feel dumb. I mean, there's like, it feels like, even as I'm a 54-year-old man, and like living in my body, sometimes still feels like junior high, right? I don't want to be dumb. I don't want to be alone. And, I want to, make sure my friends are going to be around. Like that just never seems to leave us in some ways. And so people get really, like they hear these phrases and they haven't caught up. And I will just encourage us, if you hear a phrase in any of this, whether we're talking about faith stuff or, because maybe I know a lot of people listening to this podcast they're not as embedded in the Christian tradition as we are. So we'll throw around a phrase, where I'll say something like the Apostle Paul, and that might be new to you. Like that doesn't mean that you should disconnect from the conversation, or if someone uses an acronym or uses it means that's like a little hyperlink in your brain to click on and say, I wonder what that is. And so we'd encourage you like to follow those paths, right? And to chase that down and to move around this, because this is the thing that, for me in the Christian tradition, there's this beautiful phrase of saying that you live your life in a way that renews your mind. It's a way of like reminding. If you look at the word to remind, right, that you would renew your mind. And we get these just crazy loops running in our heads, these sort of stuck patterns around race and faith, and we just keep drilling down in the same holes. And what gets us out of that is some kind of a refresh or a renew. And a lot of that comes through language and through new voices and through embodiment. And Stephanie, I thought your comments earlier about, especially in the Christian tradition, that likes to argue for a divine embodiment, right, in the past and in the present, we would argue, as people of the Christian tradition. That embodiment is like, that's the whole ball game. That's crucial to the whole thing, is where you put your body, how your body experiences, and how other people's bodies are experienced. And so this like separation that happens between us in our society, which seems to me, I'd like to hear you all comment on this, feels like it's by design that we're separate and that we're divided. Like we're not divided by like whoopsie daisy. It's not a flaw in the system. We're divided as a feature of the system. Like this is one of the things that it decides to do. And I wonder if what our Christian tradition is supposed to do about that, short of saying, well, what we all need to have then is a multiracial church. Because I've wondered if churches really are the best place for us to be doing our cross-cultural, cross-racial experience. So anyway, I know that's a lot, but I'm just interested in people's thoughts on all this.
No, I think that, and I don't want to dominate any parts of the conversation, but I think that is the history of the church in and of itself. And I say the church with a capital C, that has to be wrestled with, right? If we are looking at the work of Mark Charles and people who understand truth and conciliation, not reconciliation, but conciliation, then we are looking at the Catholic Church. We are looking at the popes of the late 1400s, articulating in the papal bull the space of savagery and dehumanizing beings and calling them savages, that leads us to the doctrine of discovery, that leads us to the age of exploration and colonialism. That in and of itself is the history of the church as we relate it to this place we now call the United States, as we relate it to the place of the quote unquote free world, that the church itself inscribed the construct of race, the construct of savage, that separated the humanity of beings that were not European. And so, yes, this separation of us on Sundays is part of that genealogy. It's part of that heritage in which the church helped to construct.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a couple of things too. Building on that, Stephanie, I think about my earliest understanding of missions, right? Missions were not to Spain or France or Europe. Mission was to Africa. It was to a continent composed of Black people, right? And that was that we white Southern Christians were bringing something. We were bringing Jesus to people who didn't know Jesus, but they all looked like that. They all looked like Black folks, and there's so much wrong with that, but it's so much the framework of how my Christianity anyway was expressed. So I think there's that, and then I also think that there's this feeling that we're of power that is baked into it. When we think about where is the place to have this conversation, and secondarily, it feels like this is not by a whoopsie do. It just so happened. It's actually a structural thing. Yeah, I think it's a structural thing framed around power and who has it. And as long as as long as white people are controlling the conversation, controlling the space, then we're not going to want to share it with people. I think that's what we see a little bit. And I know this is tangential here, but I think that's what we see in this last gasp, or perhaps it's a last gasp, but the white supremacist movement and the rise of white nationalism, again, showing its head. What is that? But this last gasp of we must stay in authority. 2030, when there'll be more people of color than there are white people in America, and or 2050, and that's a very frightening thing for white folks. Let's just name it, right?
It's not tangential. It is by design. The idea that the vast majority of Americans today who have no historical, archaeological understanding of Christianity think it is a white faith is problematic. The first person biblically to be quote unquote converted is a Black person, is an African, right? And the Coptic Church is located where in Eastern Africa, in places that we understand to be known as Ethiopia, right? So the idea that Christianity is white is part of folks not knowing, and the way in which whiteness has co-opted faith and religion as a tool.
So kind of get back to some of what you were saying, Doug, when you're talking about the challenges in having this conversation. I mean, this is huge stuff we're talking about. So one of the biggest challenges is this whole separation between the body and the soul. And this is a, heresy that really has sustained itself within most white congregations, where there is this bifurcation, the splitting between evangelism and justice, and the priority has been put on the fulfillment of the Great Commission at the expense of fulfilling the greatest commandment. And so in this belief that what we're commissioned to do is go save souls, and you still hear this language today, and it's thoroughly unbiblical. To go save souls is the mission. It really dissuades you from pushing into conversations about racism or structural sin, because at the end of the day, a lot of people who have a theology that's focused on saving souls ultimately believe that the world is going to be, burnt and, nothing, it can't be redeemed anyway. So what we're supposed to be focusing on is the eternal reality of souls, which will be disconnected from bodies at the end of the day. So that's really what we're supposed to prioritize. But there is no biblical legitimization for that worldview. But that's a predominant worldview that really has led to this kind of, disengagement with these conversations that we're saying. And I really love what Dr. King says in regards to this conversation specifically. He says, any religion that professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned about the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them is a spiritually morbid religion awaiting burial. And we have to understand that the gospel is a call to the whole person, soul and body. And when we're unconcerned about systemic racism, white supremacy, and these different things that we're naming that are actually killing people literally, and we're only concerned about their souls, we are not living into the gospel of Jesus Christ. I see this a lot within the prison ministries that I help kind of usher people into and kind of help speak some words of correction into, where a lot of people are going to save souls. They're going to say these wayward souls who kind of are full of depravity, we have to go and share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them so their souls can be saved. And I'm like, well, first, the gospel is already present behind bars. There are already people who know Jesus, who are part of the body of Christ. We just don't include them in our perspective of what the body of Christ is. And you're not coming back here to save souls. You're coming back here to make disciples. And this is one of the biggest misses the church has had in the West. We are not called to just go make converts. We are called to make disciples who make disciples. And discipleship means that we have to take the whole person seriously and not just focus on their souls. And then lastly, I'll do this because you said we need to talk about definitions. So I want to make a definition. We've been talking about a lot of different things. We've talked about racism a number of different times. So I want to provide a definition for racism so we're all on the same page. So the academically affirmed definition of racism is prejudice plus the power to reinforce one's prejudice systemically, legislatively, institutionally. The reality is that all human beings have prejudices, but we don't all have access to power to reinforce those prejudices legislatively, systemically, institutionally. And so this is where a lot of folks want to talk about like reverse racism. This is where that conversation starts to fall flat. And I know we'll pick that up a little bit more in future sessions, but I wanted to provide a baseline for what we're talking about since we've been using the language of racism so often here.
Yeah, this is one of those moments where I think, God, this thing needs to be longer than an hour. We have to talk about this stuff more. That's why we're going to do it every week. But a couple things, Dominique, I'd be interested in your thoughts. And I heard you affirming there, Stephanie, too. And I hear people take that definition, and I like racism, that racism has to involve the power to invoke your prejudice. And I've heard people say, look, I don't care if you're prejudiced, but if your prejudice starts to lean into my life, that's where we have a whole other problem, right? But I think that lets some people, I'm not saying that's not the right definition of racism, but I think it lets some people off the hook because they're like, well, I ain't got no power. I'm just a bigot. Like I'm just and that starts to corrupt them. They then cluster together with a bunch of other people that feel they don't have any power until the group actually has power. And so maybe what you were hinting at was we also have to recognize how it is that we socially carry power and all the power that we have in our world. And this is one of the places where churches talk about themselves. Most churches, I mean, there's a few that are like big mega churches and they really think they run the show and they think they're on top of the game and all this. But most Christians, most people in churches, most, even especially evangelicals, they will say stuff like, we have no power. We're the put out ones. Like we're the ones on the bottom. We're the ones that are thought of so lowly. We're the ones that are mocked in society and picked on. So they talk about themselves like they're powerless. So then they hear a definition of race, which is that race has to be prejudice plus the power to invoke that. And they're like, well, we got off that hook. And right. I think it, so I know that was a lot, but do you have any thoughts, I don't know, Stephanie or Dominique, either of you about that part? Am I wrong that, well, I don't think I'm wrong.
You're absolutely not. You're not wrong. And again, this is why not only should this be an hour long, it should also lead to like a course and workshop facilitation. And because we could do this for 16 weeks, because then we have to turn around and say, yes, but Christmas as a holiday is institutionalized and you don't even have to think about whether or not you're going to get that day off or what have you, or if it's going to be labeled on the calendar, and Easter as well, So I see it in my classroom, especially because I teach in Colorado and we have one of the highest populations of evangelical homeschool kids coming into college, right? So when they are faced with the conversation of having to deal with white supremacy as a tool that they are privileged by, that white supremacy is not just the 3%ers or the Boogaloo or any of these fringe alt-right groups, that white supremacy is the fact that you have had the privilege of being homeschooled, right? And what that means in a mixed class society, mixed race society. So you're right. It does allow for people to examine themselves, especially through language, and say, well, I don't have this privilege, or this didn't feel like a privilege to me. This didn't feel like power. So hopefully you all will stay with us over the course of our many podcasts each week, because this could actually be a 16-week college level course that we can direct you towards.
So let me get after that in a couple of different ways. So when we talk about white supremacy, I mean, so in the founding of our nation, only free, white, male, landowning individuals could vote. From the foundation, exclusion, centering, giving exclusive access to white men's and means. When we talk about the creation of the suburbs in our country, and we talk about the fact that from 1932 to 1964, of the $120 million given to housing development in the suburbs, less than 2% of that money went to non-white families. When we're talking about racism, I like to tell people, we have to understand it on the individual, the institutional, and the systemic level. And to give you an example of this, I'm going to break it down through the history and legacy of the lynching of African Americans in our nation. So from 1877 to 1960, we know that approximately, conservative estimates say 6,000 African Americans lost their life through the grotesque nature of violence that is lynching, which is an extrajudiciary form of vigilante violence where there was a criminal justice system in place, yet white vigilantes decided to take the law into their own hands and function as judge, jury, and executioner, denying people access to their rights of due process and to stand before a jury of their peers, which honestly didn't happen until 1968 because of white supremacy. But we'll go to that later. But when we look at the fact that people were taken from their communities, killed, and virtually no one was held accountable for these racial these racial killings. There was nobody arrested and held accountable, even though in many of these cases, there are pictures in newspapers with people posing with pride by the lynched dead bodies, standing, pointing there where you can make out their images. And this man owns a corner store 2 blocks up from you, and you can make out his face, but the police choose to selectively enforce the law and not hold them accountable for their racial violence. That's racism on the individual level. When we talk about it on an institutional level, when we know that this many African Americans were killed through this barbaric nature of violence, but yet we choose not to put lynchings into our K through 12 curriculum in regards to U.S. history. So therefore, people don't know this history and then don't live in light of this history. That's an institutional choice. And then systemically, again, the choice to selectively enforce the law and not hold people who committed these acts of racial violence accountable, and actually have people be, institutionally accountable and not allow them to commit racial violence with immunity. Then we start to see how, if we try to address racism on just one level and not all three, we're going to be inadequate in our response, and it's going to continue to persist in our nation. And so this is just and I can do this for a ton of different topics, but that's just one example of why we have to understand racism beyond, I don't feel like I have power, or I don't feel like I have access to people with power, when laws and customs have been set up in a way that are going to benefit you and disenfranchise others. It's not about just individual feelings. It's about systemic institutional realities that are cultivating these very different life expectancies and chances for people based off race.
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah,
good.
it is so good. And it's both those things. It's for me to care about that structural change, I've also got to be pierced in my individual, the house I live in, right? It's all those, all that knowledge has got to move from my head into this embodied response to the world. It's got to be something real. It's got to be. I go back, Dominique, to what you said about discipleship and the impoverished nature of our discipleship. And I feel like part of that is because it's been about just how to be a good person, how not to lie, not to, I don't know, cheat on my taxes, how to not be unfaithful in my marriage, that kind of stuff. But it's more than that. I mean, it's Jesus coming to save entire communities, and that I am part of a community, and that somehow my responsibility is not just to be a good wife and mother and a good employee. It's to be a good person in the common space for the common good, right? That's the thing. That's the thing I feel like we keep missing in our framework as church leaders and as church goers.
It makes me think so much about like maybe we should just add to the list of like what makes you a good person, that you're working on racism and you're working on it in you and internal, right? Like instead of saying like, hey, don't moralize the faith. I don't know. I think we could be a lot more moral, and it would probably do us all a lot of good if people were more moral, and we included in the morality that work, right? And maybe it's this idea, Dominic, thinking about your phrase, that our spirituality, maybe even framing it like that, this probably isn't a word, but if we had a bodyality instead of a spirituality, where we weren't talking about our spirit, but our bodies and how we actually lived in the world. Because I think you have a hard time getting to Jesus-oriented spirituality, because the whole thing is about what happens in and through and with the body. And, Stephanie, your comments earlier about that the first convert even in the New Testament book of Acts, individual story that's told, is an Ethiopian eunuch. I think that's the passage you were referring to. I mean,
Absolutely.
I've been around that passage so much in my life. And you know what everybody asks? What's a eunuch?
Yes.
When the point of the story
Yes.
is it's an Ethiopian, right? Like there's an Ethiopian now, and that a Jew from the homeland of Jerusalem, right? The Philip is sent to an Ethiopian eunuch. So saying that your social space of being a eunuch, meaning you have a certain role sexually, and it allows in non-sexual norm conforming people, right? I mean, the fact that the eunuch is the first story in the book of Acts and the conversion, right, is that it's non-normative sexual, and then and at the same time that it's what we would call race now, in the race narrative that has been introduced to us, but cultural difference for sure. In the first century, as they would notice it, they would describe this. And now you've got this powerful story that is the framing narrative for all this.
Yes.
And yet that whole story is sort of looked at as like, boy, I mean, how did Philip disappear out after he talked to the Ethiopian? Like it's all missed, because I literally think people don't even know that those are the clues that we're supposed to follow. And that's the framing of our minds. That's the fact that so many of us, and I don't think it's just the fact that we don't know. I think it's the fact that we know things that just ain't so, right? We know things that aren't right, and those are then we're applying that filter, and that's actually interrupting the narrative. So there seems to be a lot of unlearning that has to happen in all of this. And if you think about like a kind of faith walk that is simultaneously letting go and taking hold, those two things kind of happening all the time, it's powerful. And I'll just make this last comment, and then we're going to wrap up. Everybody can get a last bit. But for a lot of people, white people that I know, and it's true of the people in the church that I've been a part of for 20 years and people in my own family and all, they really feel this racial reckoning happening. I think we're in one of those moments in American history where, again, we're going through a mass racial reckoning that feels different. And it's not that other people didn't do it. This isn't the first time. We've had these awakenings, and people have awakened, and then the next generation has dozed off. And so it's the pattern of this sort of consistently. But people are waking up, and there's a lot of guilt that people have, and they don't know what to do with it. And one of the problems in our Christian spirituality is we don't know what to do with our own guilt. I'm not talking about shame. I'm not talking about like someone putting on you something you shouldn't be responsible for, making you feel trapped in your responsibility. I'm talking about where people are like, no, I actually, my fingerprints and DNA are all over this crime scene. So I was part of it, and I don't know what to do about it. And it can have a heaviness to it that I think is solemn and important and significant. But it can't be the only way, right? Like there's got to be a calling. There's got to be a calling in. We talk a lot in this podcast about not just calling people out, but calling people in. And that's a notion that I wonder about. And I know you all, that we're going to talk about race not as a topic, but as the context of how we talk about topics, right? So it's going to be there. But do you all have any thoughts on sort of, in just our final minutes here, on the calling in action, or the thing that would enliven someone along with the sense of reckoning and the sense of realization and feeling heavy about the realities of the world that they've benefited from and lived in?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. When we pray the Lord's Prayer, we pray thy will be done, that kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as is in heaven. And to me, it's mind-boggling that we can pray that prayer knowing that Revelation 7:9 gives us a picture of what heaven will be. All nations, all tribes, all languages gathered around the throne, praising our Lord. But yet we can go and live our daily lives and be content with segregation. Be content with not being in relationship with our brothers and sisters in the mosaic nature of the kingdom of God. And so how can we earnestly and sincerely pray that prayer, but continue to live in a way that actually is not moving towards that? And so I think for me, when I think about the calling in, the kingdom of God, even before we have the language of the kingdom in the Old Testament, was multi-ethnic, was mosaic, was multinational. And so I think if we really want to be a part of what the Spirit is willing into existence as opposed to working against it, then we have to do a true examination of our lives and see where we are understanding diversity as a revelatory gift from God as opposed to a problem to be solved.
Yeah. Can I just jump in on that too, Dominique? Because I feel like when I use the phrase second conversion, that is what it feels like. And it feels like you're eating from a larger dinner table, right? And the conversation's richer, and the food is better, and the wine is more plentiful. It's just all better. So somehow continuing to give the hints, the drop the seeds of how good it is, right? When the people of God dwell in unity. And the full people of God. Yeah, I just echo that. Amen and amen.
I would just add, because this is a faith podcast in general, but we are Christian pastors in specificity, that Christianity in and of itself, as it relates to guilt, is predicated on us being implicated in sin, right? So guilt has no place to put us in a space of paralysis, right? So if you are white and listening and wrestling with how do we address the white supremacy within, Christianity has already given you a model. Like, everybody's guilty. Everybody, like that is the premise of coming into relationship with Christ.
Right.
You are guilty. Now, what do we do with it? Because of the power of Christ that tells us there's grace for us. There is salvific behavior for us, even in the midst of our sin, even in the midst of our guilt. So yes, there is a reckoning that can happen because of the sacrifice, this expansiveness of what love is capable of doing.
So good. Hey, a couple comments from people on Facebook. Tom writes, as an old white guy, I'm actually hearing new things that make sense. Thank you for this thoughtful conversation. Stacy says, hey, I'm thankful that there's an audio podcast of this so I can listen again. So much. Thank you. I'm being challenged and learning. So, it's good to have those people in on it too. And we know that people are all in all kinds of spaces and places, right? We're all in our homes. Everyone's in their own place, and everyone's on their own time. They're in their own time zone, right? So for some people, this podcast is being played at, 3 a.m. Or the live stream is 3 a.m. I don't know if you're in Hawaii or if you're on the West Coast of the mainland, you're at, it's 8 a.m. and other places it's 11. And kind of in our own lives, people are just different time frames as well, right? People are waking up to different realities at different places. And so whenever you've woken up, wherever you find yourself, if the alarm's going off, it's time to wake up. And as my friend Rabbi Sharon Brose likes to say, but there is no alarm clock loud enough to wake someone from a fake sleep. So if you're fake sleeping, it's not because the alarm clock's not loud enough, right? You just take it. And a friend from Canada, Sharon from Canada, just said, don't forget people in Canada. We appreciate you too, Sharon, for being a part of this. So that's Stephanie Spalding, for those listening just on the podcast, and Dominique Gilliard and Laura Truax, and I'm Doug Padgett. And we're so glad that you've spent some time with us today and that you said that you'd be part of all of this. And we want to invite you to share this broadly and widely wherever you can with your friends if you're listening on podcast, or if you're listening on one of the social streams, tag a friend or two in it and ask them to join along as well. And you can find out all of this good stuff over there at vocommongood.com. And so we're really glad. Tomorrow we're going to be back here on our daily podcast. It's at 10 a.m. Central Time, launch time, and we're going to be talking about this great new documentary called God and Green and what happened in the environmental movement. There was a period where everybody was in on it, and then something changed. And as it turns out, there's an explanation for what happened. So we're going to be doing that tomorrow, and then science on Friday, and then back into the cycle. But Stephanie and Dominique and Laura and I will be back here on Wednesday. So thanks. Anybody else with a final word before we say common good morning to everyone?
Common good morning.
Common good morning to you.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to sign off on all of our beautiful places, and we'll